Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 32nd week of 2017. I'm Carl Estabrook. For more than a quarter century, this program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion, the news of the week, and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Our program's name, News from Neptune, comes from Noam Chomsky, who's been writing sensible things about U.S. politics for half a century. Chomsky says that in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true and will sound like it's from Neptune. Tonight, David Green and I will try to say some true things on a, what else, Nuclear Wars edition of News from Neptune. And we'll begin with your laundry list, David.
Okay, and feel free to chime in if there's anything you want to add to my little list.
Well, I figured we'd just run through the list and then go back and pick our favorites.
And keeping with the theme, I think my number one is not really about Trump per se. It's in response to an op-ed by a woman named Sarah Vowell in the New York Times called The Danger of an Incurious President, in which this NPR fan favorite and this rather droll woman, to some people anyway, argues that, I'm not sure what she argues, but I thought it was an extremely insensitive column because either actively or passively it basically supported the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima in 1945, which we just observed the 72nd anniversary of. So I found that to be a rather appalling piece of work in the liberal New York Times by a liberal sort of NPR historian who's made her name in various other ways. I haven't followed her closely because I don't really think she has much to say, but there you have it. Number two would be the axis of evil between Syria and Venezuela, and the importance of the left in understanding with all the pressure to kind of waffle and qualify our opposition to U.S. intervention in those countries, and especially Venezuela, as they had their election in the last week or so, or the last 2 weeks, continue to sort of be steadfast in not giving in to all this liberal and even leftist pressure to qualify our opposition to U.S. empire and its obviously in Latin America ongoing project. Number three is the whole red-brown issue, just to revisit that briefly. A lot of people have weighed in on that on the Counterpunch website since we spoke about it the last program we did. Eric Draitser, who's the host of the Counterpunch podcast, weighed in vociferously against the idea that we can have any alliances with those bad people on the right. And there's a lot to say about who and what these people are, but all of this seems to be predicated on the notion that that Trump, at bottom, what Draitser is arguing, what a guy named Anthony DiMaggio is arguing, and what even Paul Street has been arguing, is that there's some badass people, there's some badass white people who elected Donald Trump. And, you know, whereas I would talk about the white working class, but just to make it clear, we don't know who elected Donald Trump. The polls don't tell us who elected Donald Trump. What the polls tell us is that a few white counties in Midwestern states, which Obama took in 2008 and 2012, Trump took because apparently a few white people, enough to turn those counties and turn those states, voted for Donald Trump, whereas a few black people and brown people who might have voted for Obama and might have voted for Sanders stayed home. We're just talking about margins here. And again, we talked about I was critical, we were both critical in a letter to the editor about 2 months ago of this idea of white rage, which is being propagated in a a book by a historian or an African American studies woman named Carol Anderson that was publicized in a local paper by Sundiata Shajua, a local professor, and we were critical of that. And why that's relevant to raise again is Carol Anderson had an op-ed piece in the New York Times this past week in which white rage morphed into white resentment, a little softer tone there, but still propagating the idea that somehow there's white rage or white resentment. There's a cultural thing that explains a lot, and we don't need to talk so much about the material basis of all this in neoliberal America for 4 decades ongoing. To descend into a little silliness here, perhaps Colin Kaepernick has come up a lot recently. He's a quarterback. He's a very good quarterback who can't get a job as a backup NFL quarterback, which he certainly has the skills for, because he took a knee, as they're saying, during the national anthem at some point a year or so ago, and that was not a good thing. But the thing that I noted when I realized this was ongoing again, and this has been raised again by Carol and Aaron Ammons in their WEFT, previously mentioned WEFT radio program this past Saturday morning, I came to realize that Kaepernick wasn't protesting our wars. He was in fact supporting our wars in a sense, and using the Black Lives Matter movement to justifiably protest. But I thought it bears noting, and the criticism of it isn't I think he should be working. I think that he should be, he shouldn't be punished for this. But just wanted to note from the anti-war point of view that it rubs me the wrong way when people can support Black Lives Matter while claiming to support, implying pretty directly in his case, to continue to support our wars, and the fact that the military veterans, the black military veterans coming back from those wars, aren't being treated well, so on and so forth. That doesn't seem to be the way to understand our big picture here. And I don't think Dave Zirin, who is the resident, he is the only guy in the country who's been able to make a kind of living out of talking about sports from a supposedly left-wing point of view. He really hasn't been sharply critical of that either, although he's noted that. And then just just one more thing. A silly article in the News Gazette yesterday about 4 men, as it turns out, who have shamed our local university by doing bad things, one of whom got fired from Google for saying things about women that he probably shouldn't have said and probably are not true. But interestingly, among those 4 people, which included Jesse Jackson Jr. and all his issues, and some other guy who stole some money from a basketball team or a baseball team or did something. The 4th one was a person of Muslim background who has been indicted, not yet tried or convicted, who has been indicted of raising funds in this country for the deceased, murdered actually, cleric Anwar al-Awlaki, well known because both he and his son were killed by U.S. drone strikes in the Middle East. I'm not sure, was it in Yemen or
separate ones? Yes.
Separate ones. Yeah. But anyway, the fact that he was just kind of thrown in there seemed a little gratuitous, and I mean, I don't know what to say about it except that more should be said about that in that context. Not that it was an article worth taking seriously anyway. So there's my list.
That's quite a list. And that's scratching the surface, as you
It
yourself
is, of course. Well, it's
mentioned.
been like, what, 3 weeks since we did a show. So.
That's right, yes. If we were here, we'd get rid of this stuff beforehand.
Maybe it's been 4 weeks, I'm not sure, but anyway.
My laundry list has grown completely out of control, so...
we might have to do some dry cleaning then.
Well, really, and that might not be a bad idea. Top of the list, number one, is a piece from Global Times, the Chinese newspaper, which I started reading the last time I was in Beijing and find increasingly interesting. It's a sort of semi-official statement, not so official as the New York Times is, but almost. And it points out that if North Korea launches missiles that threaten U.S. soil first and the U.S. retaliates, China will stay neutral. That is to say, China will not back North Korea if push comes to shove between North Korea and the U.S. But if the U.S. and South Korea carry out strikes and try to overthrow the North Korean regime and change the political pattern of the Korean Peninsula, China will prevent them from doing so. So that seems pretty clear and straightforward, and since the U.S. involvement with North Korea, as the President keeps saying, is bound up with China, I think that's right. The CIA Director Mike Pompeo observed last week that China tops Russia and Iran as the biggest long-term threat. So it seems to me that if we want to evaluate China and or the U.S. and North Korea, we should be clear on what the U.S. involvement is vis-a-vis China and what China's response is. That China is not saying that they will support North Korea in an exchange with the U.S., but they are saying that they will defend North Korea if the U.S. attacks North Korea. That seems to me right. Secondly, China has pledged in its UN votes and elsewhere not to sacrifice, sorry, let's get this right. China has pledged to sacrifice its own economic interests in order to properly enforce the new sanctions on North Korea that try to restrict North Korea's development of nuclear weapons. Both Moscow and Beijing, however, call for talks between North Korea and the U.S. To resume. And it should be clear that North Korea offered such a thing twice in the Obama administration, and the Obama administration rejected it. So we're getting a slightly different picture in the saber rattling that's coming from the U.S. on this matter. At home in the U.S., and specifically at the President's home, the real political confrontation is between corporate globalists, those people who are pressing, in fact, for more war abroad, and the economic nationalists, those who are pressing for, they say, less economic inequality at home. That's much more important than left versus right, Republican versus Democrat, progressive versus conservative, whatever you have it. And we've had several more examples of this controversy, this general controversy this week. It also involves the war policy of the administration in regard to Afghanistan. Trump said Thursday that his administration is very close to deciding whether to authorize a plan to increase U.S. troop numbers in Afghanistan, as the globalists want. There are 8,000, more than 8,000 American troops now, and the globalists, the neocons in the administration and out want to double that number and are planning to do so. It's reported this week, to the great consternation of the globalists, that Trump may seek a plan that would allow him to fully withdraw troops from Afghanistan. That's an issue that is bubbling along in the White House and under the surface in Washington, and that, once again, indicates the real opposition that's going on in D.C. between the globalists and the economic nationalists. I want to talk for a minute at some point about what the purpose of U.S. war provocations in Asia, in regard to Korea, and in Europe, in regard to the Ukraine, for example. The real purpose, the long-term purpose of the fact that it's the U.S. governments that's pressing towards war in both Europe and Asia needs to be understood. That's the background of the Korean contretemps this week. The Higgins memo from the National Security Council that led to the firing of a number of staff members of the National Security Council who represent this economic nationalist strain has been published, has been leaked, of course, published, and it should be read because it gives you a better idea, perhaps, of what the real fight in the administration is about. Bruce Dixon of the Black Agenda Report, a publication, a website that should not be missed. It's extremely important, one of the best, I think, going right now, has an article in which he points out that every U.S. president makes unilateral nuclear threats. Every U.S. president, since they could do it, since Harry Truman, has made unilateral nuclear threats. It's an American tradition and not a peculiar penchant of Donald Trump. The same website, Black Agenda Report, has an absolutely swingeing account of the indecency of the black misleadership class that also should be read. If Representative Barbara Lee, the Democrat from California, is among the best of the black political class, we are in deep trouble. As Glenn Ford says on that website, our cohort of black politicians are self-serving cowards, utterly unfit to lead anything, least of all 40 million African Americans. Barbara Lee, the Democrat representative, and Tulsi Gabbard, the congresswoman from Hawaii, have joined the war party. The Democrats' two leading congressional dissidents have finally surrendered now that the party has, quote, taken the lead in the project of endless war. U.S. imperialism demands unanimous support from its servants in Congress, as we saw in the sanctions bill in Congress. I'm running out of numbers here. An unreported story we should.
That's a news flash, running out of numbers.
Well, that's true. I mean, my list, keeps growing, and but I wanted to mention something that we unfortunately rarely mention. There are perhaps as many as 4 million dead. About as many people as the U.S. killed in Vietnam, for example. There are about 4 million dead since 1998 in the Congo genocide. In 1998, the U.S. puppet armies of Rwanda and Uganda invaded the neighboring Congo, followed by armed forces from 5 other African nations. Millions of Congolese perished as their nation's wealth was plundered to enrich African warlords and sustain the industrial engines of Western Europe, the U.S., and China. The killing goes on to this day. And how many reports have you heard about the genocide in the Congo in the last month? This is number 6 or 7 or whatever it is, the new movement in this country against entitled the United National Anti-War Coalition has pointed out that any campaign which is really talking about U.S. wars and U.S. intervention has to address the role of the foreign military bases and aircraft carriers, which are huge floating military bases. The U.S. has 1,000 military bases around the world. Russia has perhaps a dozen, most of them in countries of the former Soviet Union, and China has perhaps 2. U.S. efforts to topple the socialist government in Venezuela are largely driven by Washington's quest to control the global energy market. Venezuela is a primary source of oil for the U.S. A special announcement from our researcher and cybersecurity expert, Dr. No, whose secret identity was revealed in a leak here last week. Jeff Nicholson Owens writes that I've had it with the low ratings on these emails I've been sending only to you, since Rachel Maddow's ratings are the highest of her career now that she spends most of every show covering nothing but Russiagate. I'm taking a page out of Rachel's book and going with all Russia all the time. Russiagate. Now with a new plot line. The plot line being, of course, the financial peculations of the Trump family. Much this week on the disappearance of the anti-war movement. I wonder why. And it seems to me that that's true far enough so that we must, in fact, get behind people like the UNAC and others and demand that our government remove all our troops and weapons from the Middle East and indeed elsewhere. Glenn Ford writes, the crazed, racist, stupid, boorish man in the White House this summer defied the war party and its corporate media mouthpieces, negotiating a ceasefire with the Russians in several regions of Syria and possibly ending the CIA's not so covert role as Grand Master of Islamic Jihad, which makes him less dangerous to the human species than Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, close quote. And it's to defeat that obvious point that we have this tremendous concentration on the Korean Peninsula this week. I was amused by one of the late-night television programs that asked people to find the Korean Peninsula on a map, and I think the score was 1 out of 12. There's much more here. I would like to talk a little about the White House disarray with their new chief of staff and what's really going on there. I think that's been horribly misreported, and the Kelly McMaster combine in the White House is something we should pay close attention to if we want to know about what this government is actually going to do. I think David is quite right to bring up the fact that we are in the midst of the anniversary week, we might say, for nuclear war. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, August 6th and 9th on 1945. There's only one government in history that's used nuclear bombs on human beings, and it did so without necessity, in spite of the vast mythology that occupies the minds of most Americans. A patriotic myth still pervades mainstream America that Hiroshima and Nagasaki were an unfortunate but necessary means of ending the war, the Second World War, and ultimately saving lives. This is a lie of fantastic proportions and should be described so. There's more, much more, I'm sorry to say, but you're listening to News from Neptune, and we can choose now from this smorgasbord we've laid out for you of bad news and bad accounts. Which one should be talked about? Your choice, David.
Well, just one perhaps trivial aspect, but sort of fascinating to me, is that I think I read on Mondoweiss that is it General McMaster or
yes, it's General McMaster,
Lieutenant,
National Security Advisor.
Yeah,
right.
He apparently isn't necessarily, whatever his reputation as being the hawkish voice,
right,
vis-a-vis maybe Tillerson. Apparently, when it comes to Israel, he isn't quite on board with the Israel lobby point of view on that. I don't know if you came across anything like that, but I mean, he might be a little more complicated than he's being presented in the sort of left media regarding his relationship to U.S. foreign policy.
It is complicated, and it's complicated over the fact that the relationship to Iran has been an issue at stake between the factions in the American government, and that McMaster, who is being excoriated in some circles for not being supportive enough of Israel, the evidence for that being that he's not willing to force war with Iran, as apparently Michael Flynn, the previous National Security Advisor, was doing. Flynn had written a book with one of the worst of the ideological neocons, Michael Ledeen,
right,
a while ago, saying that the real problem in the Middle East is Iran, and we've got to attack Iran. Flynn came in as National Security Advisor with the peculiar reputation of being too close to Russia. That's supposedly what the Robert Mueller is working on right now, being too close to Russia and too belligerent towards Iran. These are strange complications, and McMaster is the reverse of that, the mirror image of that. That is belligerent towards Russia and perhaps not belligerent enough towards Iran. Now, it's complicated in part because of the relationships between Russia and Iran. And it's also complicated because the parties, the factions in the White House that I was talking about, the economic nationalists, whose principal figure is Steve Bannon, and the corporate globalists, whose principal figure is the director of the Economic Council, Gary Cohn, the former president of Goldman Sachs. These divisions are serious, and indeed each side is busily trying to fire the epigony of the other side. But the outcome in terms of U.S. policy is very unclear, and not just because these two factions are working on the president, who some people suggest shows a certain unsteadiness in his choice of political objects. It's a serious problem.
But the now ex-Obama officials who move into the pundit class or the think tank class, maybe somebody like Susan Rice or whomever, they can get away now with promoting themselves as kind of peaceniks in relation to the fact that Obama put the Iran deal through against opposition of the Israel lobby and many members of Congress and so forth. And that's letting the Obama-Clinton faction off pretty lightly in terms of their being at all a force for peace. I mean, that this is the war party. It's all the war party. It's just different factions of the war party about how they go about doing it. And where's, who is it? One can say that Obama was prudent in relation to Iran and to Cuba, which is the only other thing I can think of in that regard. But as we're talking about Trump and his people, and as we're sorting those things out, and as we still have to keep in mind that the continuity. I mean, if there is any gravity in terms of the economic nationalism to which you refer, if there is any reality to that, it's up against pretty massive historical forces. You've got everything from the Koch brothers to Mike Pence sort of guiding what's going on here. And I don't see what the glimmer of light is, whether it's the economic nationalist policies or the anti-globalist, putatively anti-war policies. I don't see where the foothold is. I don't see where the traction is for people to challenge in any fundamental way or in any serious way what the U.S. global empire is. And at the same time, I don't see the Democrats, the people who still identify with the Rachel Maddows or whatever, can point to this and that, and all of a sudden they become peaceniks because they're decrying Trump's language and so forth. But they're at the same time fomenting war with Russia, or fomenting all this tension and conflict with Russia. So I just don't see where, from what we call left to right in the conventional sense, and in the sense of who's in power and who controls our mainstream media, where's the traction for anything? I don't see that. I don't see that with Steve Bannon. I don't see it with McMaster. I mean, I just don't know where I see that.
Well, remember that Trump in the campaign so attacked the neoconservative policies of the Obama administration and of the previous administrations, and we have to begin by noticing that those policies remained constant, indeed were increased from the Bush to the Obama administration, and Obama's talent was covering them over. So Trump actually attacked those policies: interventionism, the war in Iraq, even the war in Syria. All of those were attacked in the campaign, and that had an effect. You mentioned the survey data that shows that one of the groups that tilted in the presidential election were communities in the Midwest and a number of Midwest states that had been impacted by the war in the Middle East and therefore did not vote for Clinton as they had voted for Obama when he said he was going to end these wars.
What you mean, to be clear, is that there were the counties in which people died because
Exactly.
of the war.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that while people are inventing reasons for Americans voting for Trump and denying the predicted election of Hillary Clinton, it should be clear that the war was an issue and that Trump indeed attacked the neoconservative policies of previous administrations. Now, in office, he has been and people understood that. The people who understood best were the leading neocons who had been thoroughly identified with the Republican Party before this year, before the recent presidential election. They fled the Republican Party to Mrs. Clinton on the grounds that she was a reliable neoconservative warmonger and that their war policies would be carried out in a Clinton administration as they were in an Obama administration, if not more so.
People like William Crystal and Max Boot, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Now, the problem came in office. Trump is under tremendous pressure from the war party, from those who are in favor of further American wars, who are in favor of expanding American wars. Trump is under tremendous pressure to go along with it. And to some extent, he seems to. There are interesting counterexamples, and what these seem to suggest is the actual war that's going on within the administration between the Bannon forces, who are less enthusiastic about foreign wars in Afghanistan and elsewhere. Bannon has even suggested that the Afghanistan war should be privatized. We should outsource it. We should get the American military out of there and hire mercenaries insofar as we need them.
But how does that?
Very interesting.
Yes, but that sort of that brings Blackwater, or it's whatever,
Yeah.
Blackwater. That just brings that back into it. That's just helping out the whole DeVos, the whole Blackwater DeVos DeVos axis, whatever that is. I mean, how does that get us away from the war party? You know, it's still a war being privately fought. That's how wars are fought these days.
Well, this is the point that's being, I think, obfuscated by the reporting that we have available to us about what's going on within the administration. No one doubts that there's a deep faction fight in the administration between, for lack of a better name, the Bannon faction and the Cohn faction. And the National Security Advisor, General McMaster, seems to be clearly lined up with the Cohn faction, with the globalists. And as a result, the pressure on the Trump administration, on Trump himself, seems to have been so successful that the war party's policies, followed by the Obama administration, look like being continued. That's why it's so interesting that we got this week another suggestion from Trump himself that maybe we should withdraw American troops from Afghanistan. That didn't much play because we were all busy talking about Asia. But the fact of the matter is that pro and anti-war debate is buried within the administration, and it's quite serious. Foreign Policy, the journal this week, published a memorandum that led to the firing of by McMaster, of several members of the National Security Council who were accused of being on Bannon's side. A man named Higgins wrote this memorandum. I'll put it on the Facebook page for News from Neptune, and it should be read. I'm not suggesting we have here a black and white, true and false, yay and nay account of what's going on in the administration. I am suggesting we have a fight going on, and the fight includes differences on how the war policy of the United States should be continued. At least one faction, the Bannon faction, is interested in downplaying America's wars, which Trump had attacked during the campaign. What will come of that, we don't know, but we should be clear that that debate's going on. The War Party hasn't swept the board, although it looks like they have when we see things like the sanctions vote in Congress. So, I mean, there is a debate going on here, and the debate should be encouraged, and people should understand that the U.S. does indeed have options, both in Europe and Asia, and that pressing on towards war in Eastern Europe or in the South China Sea or in Korea is not the only option.
Yeah, and it should be noted if if there's a slam dunk, beyond what Glenn Ford was saying about the black misleadership class and so forth, if there's a slam dunk to help people understand what's going on, it would be the sanctions vote, in which there were 3 no votes in the House, all Republican. Justin Amash, who's becoming famous for that, and a couple of other people who for whatever reason,
One of whom's just resigned from the House.
Right, and a couple of Southerners actually.
Yes.
I don't know. Southerners. Anyway, it's just what. So there isn't really. I mean, sanctions. I mean, the absolute silliest part of this whole thing, in a sense, it's like the most mindless, conformist, like. What effect do they have, and why do they do them, and how could it possibly be helpful to deal with foreign policy in this way? They go along with that. All of them, all the Democrats, except in the Senate, Bernie Sanders. In the Senate, there were 2 votes against it: Bernie Sanders and Rand Paul.
Right.
Okay, so that's what we've got. So who's arguing that the Democrats can be of any use to people who are genuinely propose a different future for this country that would steer us away from global empire, and in the process of that, of course, create a very different society in this country regarding economic inequality and all the rest of it.
I mean, we need to put the hysterical accounts from the American media, which, as I say, are not paralleled by anything, I think, since the McCarthy days. But we have to take these hysterical accounts and put them in the context of long-term American policy, and particularly war policy. And the weekend of Hiroshima, or the week of Hiroshima and Nagasaki anniversaries, is probably a good time to do that, because we Americans, all of us, even people as superannuated as we, have grown up with an account of war in the modern world that's absolutely false and fantastic. The only parallel I can think of is the one that's you can watch on what is the station right now, Philip K. Dick's novel about a German and Japanese victory in the Second World War.
Man in the High Castle.
Man in the High Castle, which suggests how propaganda might be manipulated had things come out somewhat differently. But the thing to take away from that is to realize that the propaganda that Americans have grown up with and believe is a fairy tale. It's nonsense. It's not an accurate story at all about what happened in the Second World War in regard to Germany and Japan. And therefore, out of that mythology, we're left with an account of what the U.S. is doing in the world that is propagandistic in the extreme and needs to be understood better by Americans to make choices about what our government should be allowed to do. The notion that the U.S. is spreading peace and freedom around the world, having righteously risen up and defeated fascism in Europe and Asia in the 1940s, is, as I say, whole cloth. It's complete nonsense. And the notion that the U.S. is spreading peace and freedom by killing more than 20 million people since the end of the Second World War, which is what American presidents have done, is absolutely false. To teach some real history about what the U.S. what the U.S. is doing and what the U.S. has done, is to get to a point where we can evaluate what the U.S. is doing right now in its war making, particularly in the Middle East. Take the example of Iran. that unfortunately may be an example that we're going to have to take. But the idea that the Obama administration nuclear deal, as it's called, with Iran was a departure from American war making is absolutely false. What the Obama administration did was differ slightly on a matter of tactics with previous administrations in regard to Iran. The real history of the United States and Iran has got to be based upon the fact that the United States overthrew an elected government in Iran in 1953, imposed a vicious dictatorship, which the Iranian people themselves finally threw off in 1980. The point is that the American government has not forgiven the Iranians for overthrowing the government we picked out for them. And we picked out that government for them because of the long-term importance to the United States of what Henry Kissinger called an overall framework of order in the Middle East. An overall framework of order is a set of political relationship that allows the U.S. to control the flow of hydrocarbons from the Middle East. That's bedrock. That's the fundamental point of American policy. And all the Obama administration did was manipulate the tactics a little bit about how that control should be exercised. The deal with Iran, which had very little to do with nuclear weapons, the U.S. knew that Iran did not have, was not making a nuclear weapon. The deal with Iran had primarily to do with the U.S. reincorporating Iran, a great source of oil, into the overall framework of order, the control of oil flows from the Middle East. The Obama administration thought they could do it with an agreement with Iran, and perhaps they have. Others thought that no, particularly the government of Israel, thought no, Iran has to be attacked and subdued and made obedient by military means. This is a tactical, not a strategic difference. The U.S. strategy remains the same, and the U.S. strategy is finally to use war in order to get its way, if it hasn't been able to do it by manipulations such as the Iran agreement.
Yeah. I guess, just to put this in a more general way, maybe in a more personal way, it's the difficulty we have in getting getting people to understand what we think is true about the U.S. role in the world, given we're just humans and we can be wrong about this, that, and the other thing, but the evidence is pretty overwhelming if you look at it, and all you have to do is look at the way the rest of the world looks at us. And, 100 million people could be wrong, but 6 billion people probably are not wrong. And people of goodwill, people that we work with in various political aspects, locally, at the state level, and so forth, feel like it's none of their business, really, when it gets down to it. They don't want to deal with that. They don't want to, that's like the third rail that they talk about in relation to various other issues. It's like, well, we can deal with some local issues, domestic issues, healthcare, which is absolutely fundamental, of course. But anti-war, it's like, well, how could we do that? Who do we influence? What with the deep state? What with all the propaganda? What with the really vociferous response, the really ugly response that you always get when you criticize a flyover at a football game or whatever, something like that. Or with the Colin Kaepernick thing, it's like you can go so far, but you can't go farther. I don't understand. I guess I need to talk to more people and find out what's really going on in their minds. But I don't, I kind of understand that in a certain way, but it undermines, if they're working for good things, it undermines what they're working for. It undermines the sort of moral credibility of what they're working for when they can't oppose U.S. foreign policy just like I think it undermines the moral credibility of, say, Jewish religious institutions when they support Israel, the manner in which they have for all these years. Not that they support them as vociferously as they once did. That's changed in certain ways, but you know, I don't know where we go and talk. I mean, I've batted this around in my own mind in relation to, well, you know, do you talk to people just about things that you talk to people, you work with people about things that we you know agree on, like healthcare. Hope that you have a win there, and that people understand that. But in the meantime, there's all these wars going on.
I think the biggest problem for American politics right now is that the generations-old anti-war movement, which has been so trammeled up by American propaganda, the anti-war movement that blossomed in regard to Southeast Asia in the 1960s, that anti-war movement and its follow-up, because it didn't go away, it continued in regard to Central America, in regard to Southwest Asia after that, although liberal critics kept saying, oh, where did the anti-war movement go? It was always there. It was all along. That anti-war movement has been eviscerated by the war party, which is not limited by any means to one political party, has been eviscerated by the war party, the nefarious attempt to make sure that American war-making continues. And the present form of that evisceration of the anti-war movement is the pretense that anti-war is anti-Trump, that we have got to get that man Trump out of there because he might blow up the world in the dispute with North Korea. That's an amazing gift to the pro-war party in the United States because, of course, Trump was elected after campaigning in opposition to regime change war in Syria, the Iraq-Libya sorts of interventions, the free trade pacts, which were bound up with American war-making, entitlement cuts at home, and greater conflict with Russia, all of them aspects of the neoconservative, neoliberal war party that Trump was speaking against. And that's what got him elected finally, and that's what the war party has been working so vigorously to overcome. The fear is that they've managed to do it.
Well, yes, but where is any support within the Trump administration for expanding or at least not cutting back on federal social programs and all of this new money for the military and these cutbacks on the programs, that the federal programs, that part of the federal budget, less than half of the discretionary federal budget, which is used to sort of help people in housing, education, and so forth. Not that those things have become problematic in various ways. Where's among all these people, whatever their differences are, nobody's arguing for increased. Well, okay, they're arguing for an infrastructure program, but it's within the framework of this public-private partnership thing. It's not. It's not giving me anything to grab onto here, Carl. I'm sorry. It's just not giving me anything to feel like, well, there's real hope among these people that something good is going to come out of this. Although I understand that it's less of a war party. Overall, it's less of a war party than the people that just left earlier this year.
What do you make of Steve Bannon's suggestion of raising taxes on the wealthy last week?
Gee, I hadn't heard that. I guess
well,
it's because
exactly.
of being in public.
No, my point is that you haven't heard. That's the whole point.
Yeah.
The media account of the fight going on between economic nationalists and corporate globalists within the government as a whole, including within the White House, is not being reported. We have an overwhelmingly one-sided and occupied media regime in which these accounts are not being given. People are not hearing about them at all. Insofar as anyone mentioned Bannon's suggestion of a 44% tax rate on the wealthy, it was ridiculed. Oh, this silly man, what's he saying that? No possibility of doing that.
What does he want to spend that money on, though? Was there any word in...
That's difficult to say. I mean, once again, the notion that making war abroad and spending money on the military are the same thing is certainly false. Give an account of military Keynesianism as it existed in this country after the Second World War. We've got to understand that the war making and war preparations, if you like, are not ineluctably connected. Indeed, in some ways, they could be opposed to one another.
Well, I think there's, I think what we have to offer between the two of us is an understandable tension on, I know you don't like to use words like left, and I understand now with what we understand, with all the Republicans and Democrats voting for sanctions, what does left and right mean in any of that context?
Very little.
What does D and R mean
Very
in
little.
any of that? In the context, I get that. But it's
Tulsi
still,
Gabbard threw her hat in the ring with the war party this week.
Yes, and it's still coming. There's been a lot of ridicule, appropriate ridicule, I think, of the new senator from California, Kamala Harris, who's out on the Hamptons raising money, and people are the idea that people may see her as the next Obama, the next kind of chocolate president for people who who want to save the Democratic Party. I'm not getting on any of that. I'm not on board with any of that. I think we do need to reach out to people, stop labeling people, and just find out who's for what, who's against war, who's for single-payer health care. Organize those people, regardless of what their identity was, regardless of whether they might have a bad attitude about this or that.
We've got to go. You've been watching News from Neptune for the 32nd week of 2017, a Nuclear Wars edition, presented by Carl Estabrook and David Green, produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Andrew Scollery, with thanks to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson for research. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.